Good afternoon. As always, my name is Aman K. Sharma, the president of the Federalist Society this year. Happy to see this is a good turnout. And on behalf of the Federalist Society, of course, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, the Conservative Case for Same-Sex Marriage with Professor Dale Carpenter and Professor Mark Spindlin. It's a speech with commentary format, so we're going to have about a 30-minute introduction by Professor Carpenter, and then we'll have that will be followed by Professor Spindlin's comments. I'll give the introductions as always before we get started, and then I'll hand it over to Professor Carpenter. Professor Mark Spindlin is a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. Following law school, he clerked for Justice Alex Batchelder of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He was the Ronald F. Lewis Fellow for Law Teaching at Harvard Law School, taught as a visiting instructor at University of Michigan Law School, and then spent 2 years as a Greenwald Fellow in Bioethics and Health Policy at Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins. His recent scholarship focuses on family law, bioethics, public health ethics, and health law. Professor Dale Carpenter, our guest for today, teaches and writes in areas of constitutional law, the First Amendment, sexual orientation, and the law. In 2007, he was appointed the Earl R. Lawson Professor of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the University of Minnesota. Since 2007, he has served as an editor of Constitutional Commentary. Professor Carpenter earned his BA in History magna cum laude from Yale. He then received a JD with honors from the University of Chicago Law School. At the University of Chicago, he was the editor-in-chief of the University of Chicago Law Review. He received both the D. Francis Boostine Prize for Excellence in Legal Scholarship and the John M. Olin Foundation Scholarship for Law and Economics. Professor Carpenter clerked for the Honorable Edith H. Jones of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit from 92 to 93. After his clerkship, he practiced at Vinson & Elkins in Houston and at Howard Rice, Nemirovsky, Kennedy, Falk, and Rapkin in San Francisco. He's a member of the state bars of Texas and California. He appears often on TV, radio, and is a print commentator for issues of constitutional law, First Amendment, and sexual orientation. With that, please join me in welcoming first Professor Dale Carpenter.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here. I do have some bad news, however, to start. If you came here today expecting to see the marriage of Ronald Reagan, Bill O'Reilly, I'm going to have to disappoint you. It's not going to happen. But here's my thesis this afternoon. And the basic idea is that gay marriage is a conservative idea, although it often seems that conservatives will be the last people to realize it. I am going to present an argument defending that claim within a particular strand of conservatism, sometimes called traditionalism or Burkeanism, after the 18th century British statesman and writer Edmund Burke. I'll describe a little bit in more detail what I mean in a moment, but basically it emphasizes respect for tradition and history and wants change to come incrementally if it is to come at all. A couple of things I'm not going to do is present a constitutional argument for same-sex marriage, conservative or otherwise, and I'm not going to argue normatively for Burkeanism as an approach to social change. I'm going to take Burkean premises as a starting point and see if we can come up with an argument within that tradition, within that school of thought. So here's what I am going to do. Basically, 5 different things. First of all, I'll describe Burkean traditionalism. Second, based on that idea, I will sketch a case against same-sex marriage based on that tradition. Third, I'll present some empirical learning about homosexuality and gay families that I think bears on the Burkean concerns. Fourth, I will discuss 2 long-term trends in society and in culture and in law, certainly, that make same-sex marriage thinkable for a Burkean conservative. And fifth and finally, in light of all that, I'll reconsider some of the objections to same-sex marriage arising from the Burkean concerns that I've talked about. So first of all, what is Burkean conservatism? I think it may be best captured in a quote from Burke's most influential and most well-known work, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Here's what Burke had to say. Instead of casting away all our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree. And to take more shame to ourselves, you really have to like the way Burke rights, to take more shame to ourselves. We cherish them because they are prejudices. And the longer they have lasted, and the more generally they have prevailed, the more we cherish them. We are afraid to put men to live and trade, each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that that stock in each man is small, and that individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. The basic idea coming from Edmund Burke's work is, again, that we should respect tradition and history. We should prefer, generally, stability to change, continuity to experiment, the tried to the untried. Burke was not opposed to all evolution in a society's practices, traditions, and values. Instead, he counseled patience and deliberation in reform. He wanted what he called a slow but well-sustained progress. In other words, Burke supported incremental changes, if at all, rather than the convulsive upheavals that he saw in events like the French Revolution. A modern American, a 20th century American student of Edmund Burke, a man named Russell Kirk, who was himself an influential figure in modern intellectual conservatism after the war, noted as follows in reading Burke: "Does the observance of prejudice and prescription condemn mankind to a perpetual treading in the footsteps of their ancestors? Burke has no expectation that men can be kept from social change, or that a rigid formalism is desirable. Even ancient prejudices and prescriptions must sometimes shrink before the advance of positive knowledge. So even what we presently regard as fundamental principles are not and cannot be, under a Burkean view, immune to critique and revision based on lessons derived from experience and from the advance of practical knowledge." So second, what would a traditionalist or Burkean case against same-sex marriage be? I think it would consist primarily of four elements or observations. The first would be that gay marriage, of course, would be a change. So we should be resistant and suspicious of it on that account alone. Second, marriage is a long-standing, cherished, and important institution that has never before included the union of a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, at least not until the day before yesterday. Further, its historic practice of uniting men and women, and not same-sex partners, may contain within it a reason that our logic can no longer fully grasp. Third, gay marriage is being brought to us in the service of non-marital and abstract causes, things like equality and inclusion and tolerance. Abstract principles like these may make us feel good, but they are often simply a decoration for a conclusion arrived at from experience, which is fine. But when they are applied a priori, independent of experience and long-standing practices, they can be dangerously disconnected from human society, causing much destruction. And fourth, perhaps worst of all for Burkean, and again I'm sketching this case against, same-sex marriage is a radical change being forced upon us suddenly by impatient activists and courts. These activists and courts are, moreover, explicitly hostile to tradition as a basis for law. So basically, to sum it up, to support same-sex marriage, we have to abandon two very important traditions, long-standing traditions. First of all, we have to abandon the long-standing traditional understanding that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. And second, we have to abandon the long-standing condemnation of homosexuality as aberrant and dangerous. So for a traditionalist, a Burkean, gay marriage then is perfectly traditional, except for two little problems. One has to do with the gay part, and one has to do with the marriage part. So it's not obvious why a traditionalist should support same-sex marriage. That, I think, is the strongest case that can be made on Burkean grounds against the recognition of same-sex marriages. Against that critique, how might we begin to construct a response? Well, I think the response would begin with an observation that much of public policy toward homosexuals was developed in a time when we didn't know much about them as a group. How they lived, what they were like, how many there were, what their needs and aspirations were. So we filled in the gaps with myths about homosexuals, that they were dangerous, predatory, especially toward children, psychopathic, maladjusted, and so on. That has changed in the past century, and especially in the past 50 years, as homosexuals have come out of the closet in large numbers, and homosexuality itself has become a subject of systematic study. From that study, a strong consensus has developed in the scientific, medical, sociological, and psychological community about at least some of the important characteristics of this group. Namely, that homosexuals are not mentally ill or dangerous, not more prone than others to pedophilia, and that they are very much like heterosexuals in all measures of adjustment and needs for love and companionship. While we don't know with certainty what causes a person to become homosexual or have a homosexual orientation, or a heterosexual orientation for that matter, we do know that homosexual orientation is not consciously chosen, and that it cannot easily be changed, if at all. It is not contagious. As Judge Posner once wrote, homosexuals are not created by recruitment, persuasion, or seduction. Now, there are people who dissent from one or more of the propositions that I just advanced. It would be very surprising if in a country of 300 million people there were not some dissenters. But it must be said that they now hold a distinctly minority view that has no good empirical support. And recall that Burke believed that even ancient prejudices must shrink before the advance of positive knowledge. Then consider some of the dimensions of the issue that we're talking about. There are about 9 million gay people in the United States if you take the most conservative estimates that we have based on self-identification in a variety of studies. Probably be more than that, but that's the most conservative figure. According to a federal government estimate, there are in the range of 600,000 or 700,000 same-sex couple households in the United States, and that is probably an undercount. We'll know more after the 2010 census. But these are things that the government did not even begin to count until 20 years ago. When you think about it, it's a lot of people who will never have a reasonable prospect of marriage in their lives, who will be cut off from what a traditionalist would hold is the most moral life available or possible for a sexually active person. Also consider that, at least according to the 2000 census, about 20% of the male couple households and about a third of the female couple households in the United States are raising children. Overall, there are at least 1 million children in this country today being raised by gays and lesbians, either singles or in couples. None of these children have the protection and benefits that marriage would provide to their families. Now again, we didn't know the dimensions of this problem or this phenomenon until fairly recently. So I think that ignorance alone allowed us to ignore or to dismiss the issue. The question is, now that we know, what do we do? Well, let me point out a couple of trends in law, culture, and politics, one having to do with marriage and the other having to do with homosexuality, that have converged over the past few decades and make, I think, sane